You look them straight in the eye. Shake hands. Offer a polite nod, perfectly timed to the familiar rhythm of social exchange. And then just a few seconds later, a heavy sensation settles in. You realize you no longer remember the name of the person standing in front of you, not vaguely, not almost, but completely blank. On the outside, you're still smiling, still holding eye contact. But on the inside, your awareness has already sunk too deep, and the name, something that only ever survives on the surface, has drifted away. If you've ever been in that moment, this isn't a story about having a bad memory. It's about how you used up all the oxygen in your brain to dive somewhere deeper. After that moment, what bothers you most isn't really forgetting the name, but the very familiar feeling that comes with it, a trace of embarrassment, a hint of self-reproach, a quiet question echoing in your mind about whether you were being rude, disrespectful, or whether there is simply something wrong with you. Meanwhile, on the outside, you remain standing there, shoulders slightly tense, your smile held longer than necessary, your breathing becoming shallow without you even noticing. You hear the other person continue to speak, but your mind is already busy with something else. What needs to be set down clearly, right here, is this. You are not rude, and you are not careless. Forgetting a name does not happen because you don't care about the person standing in front of you. On the contrary, it often happens when you care too much, when you are tracking whether their eye contact is consistent, whether their voice carries tension, whether the small pauses reveal something different from the words themselves, when you are trying to keep the interaction smooth, safe, and aligned with the expected social rhythm. On the surface, everything looks fine, but underneath, your attention has already begun to sink. And in order to sink, attention needs an anchor, something heavy enough to pull it away from the surface. A name cannot do that. It is too light. It floats. It does not help you go deeper into what is actually happening. And in that moment, your unconscious is forced to choose. Not because it did not hear the name, but because in order to dive, it must let go of whatever cannot serve as an anchor. You did not forget because you did not care. You let go because you needed to go deeper. You are not rude. And that alone is enough for you to let out a small breath. When you look back at that moment, what happened was not a memory failure in the usual sense. Your brain wasn't broken. It wasn't lazy either. What was actually taking place was a very specific biological limit. Human attention is not an infinite resource. It's more like the oxygen tank of a diver. You only have a finite supply. And when you begin to dive deeper into a social interaction, that oxygen is consumed far more quickly than when you're just swimming near the surface. When you are reading someone's eyes, their tone of voice, the subtle mismatches in their expressions, your brain is engaging in a high-demand form of processing. Research on working memory shows that in emotionally charged, socially pressured contexts, cognitive capacity is consumed very rapidly. This isn't a matter of being smart or not smart. It's a matter of load. The more signals you try to process at the same time, the more the brain is forced to choose what gets held and what has to be released. But it's not just oxygen. When you dive deeper, there is also pressure, processing pressure. Each deeper layer of social interaction requires the brain to integrate more layers of information. Words, emotions, context, risk, opportunity. This pressure isn't loud. It's quiet. But it is strong enough to make your head feel heavy, slightly dizzy, and quickly fatigued, even if you haven't spoken much at all. In that state, the brain has to shed load in order to avoid overload. And this is where the name gets dropped. Not because it isn't socially important, but because biologically, it doesn't help you withstand the pressure. A name is not an anchor. It can't pull you down. It doesn't help you stay stable at the depth you're currently operating in. Signals about intention, emotion, or inconsistency, on the other hand, do. Your unconscious, in that moment, chooses to retain what helps you survive the interaction. Everything else has to be offloaded. Models of attentional control show that the brain gives absolute priority to signals related to safety and behavioral prediction. Knowing how the other person is feeling so you can respond appropriately is 1,000 times more important than knowing what their name is. Forgetting a name, in this context, is not a failure. It is a load reduction mechanism, a way for your brain to keep functioning under pressure without collapsing entirely. You didn't forget the name. Your brain was lightening the load so you could withstand the pressure, and once you understand that, you can breathe out a little more. At the surface, everything is clear because there is light coming from the outside. Names, titles, and social roles appear sharply defined under that sunlight, and as long as you stand high enough, in bright enough conditions, you can see everything without much effort. But once your attention has moved away from the surface, once you are no longer operating within that ready-made field of light, the familiar rules begin to lose their grip. At depth, there is no sunlight. There is no shared illumination that makes things easy to see and easy to name. And it is precisely in that darkness that a different kind of light begins to appear. Not light that is cast onto something, but light that originates from within. In the deep ocean, only living creatures emit light, not to be seen, but to survive. That light is not loud, not performative, and it does not require anyone's confirmation. It is just enough to say, "This is real." When you descend into an encounter in this way, what you are looking for is no longer a social label, not a name, not a role, not the other person's position in the surface-level order. You are searching for that self-generated light signals that are subtle, almost imperceptible, but impossible to fake. In depth psychology, there is a quiet distinction between what needs external light in order to exist and what carries its own light. You don't need to name it. You only need to recognize how familiar this feeling is. That in the encounters that exhaust you the most, what holds your attention most tightly is not information, but coherence. Not what is said, but what is left unsaid. And when you go deep enough to perceive that, the name becomes invisible not because it is meaningless, but because it has no capacity to emit light in this darkness. At this level, your memory no longer functions like a list. It functions like a sensor. It retains what has existential weight, what continues to glow even after all external light has disappeared. And you don't need to be proud of this. You also don't need to apologize for it. At that depth, only what is truly alive emits light. And the fact that your attention orients itself toward that light is not a moral choice. It is simply how your consciousness knows how to operate. When you realize this, there is a very quiet moment in which you no longer feel the need to explain why you remember this and forget that. You simply know that you were looking in the right place, and that, in itself, is enough. Perhaps that is why there are people in your life who, despite not having seen them for a very long time, still appear with a strange clarity. You may not remember their names. Sometimes you don't even remember where they came from, but you remember how it felt to be near them. You remember the look in their eyes the last time they saw you. You remember the atmosphere of that conversation, as if it is still suspended somewhere in your body. And each time you think back, that feeling returns faster than any name ever could. You may have run into someone like this again on the street or in a familiar room. You recognize them instantly, even before your brain has time to reorganize the data. You remember how they stand. You remember the rhythm of their speech. You remember their very particular way of being silent. But when the moment comes to say their name, you hesitate. The name doesn't arrive. It slips away like a detail that never quite attached itself to memory. And in those brief seconds, what remains is not a word, but a feeling. This isn't random. Human memory was never designed to store everything in the same way. There are parts of the brain that specialize in retaining faces, voices, and emotional tone, separate from the systems that process names and symbolic labels. That is why it's not surprising that names are a very light layer of information. They have high buoyancy, so they rise to the surface and drift away. Feelings, on the other hand, are heavy. They sink and settle at the bottom of your memory, and when memory has to choose, it often keeps what once made the deepest contact. In moments of nostalgia like this, you may notice something very subtle, that what truly binds you to others was never the label. It was the way someone made you feel when you were near them. And when memory returns in this way without names, without verification, you can pause for a moment, simply to sense that names may drift away, but feelings remain. And perhaps that is already enough for you to know that you did not miss anything that truly mattered. There is another way of looking at this entire experience, one that is calmer, more even. Not to glorify it and not to criticize it, but simply to place it where it belongs. When you look back, you can see that nothing here is random. Every mode of attention carries a cost. At the surface, you keep the names, you keep the order, you keep the familiar rhythm of social exchange, but you trade away depth. At the bottom, you gain access to essence, to nonverbal signals, to subtle coherence or misalignment. And the price you pay is that you cannot carry everything that is light and buoyant. Depth has its cost, but it is a cost worth paying for what it allows you to perceive. In the psychology of attention, it is often said that cognitive energy flows in the direction of where you place your attention. You cannot fully invest in the surface and in depth at the same time. Each choice requires a redistribution of energy. When you direct your attention toward keeping a social interaction safe, toward reading subtle signals, toward understanding what is actually unfolding, you are allocating resources to a different level of processing. That does not make you better or worse than anyone else. It simply means your system is operating under a different priority, and that priority has very specific consequences. What matters is not turning this difference into an identity to cling to. You do not need to say that you belong to depth or that you don't function well at the surface. These are not opposing camps. They are two modes of existence. There are times when it is necessary to stay at the surface, to hold names, to keep rhythm, to maintain small but necessary structures. And there are times when, quite naturally, you descend not because you want to be different, but because that is where your attention knows how to operate. There is no judgment here, only an understanding of trade-offs. When you see things this way, a familiar weight begins to fall away. You no longer have to ask what needs fixing. You no longer have to try to improve something that was never broken. You only need to recognize that each time you forget a name, it is not a personal failure. It is the trace of an attentional choice made at a very deep level. And when you allow yourself to see that, your body responds as well. Your breath grows deeper. Your shoulders loosen. You do not need to fix yourself. You only need to stand firmly in the way you operate. And in that place, there is no noise you need to push back against. And at this point, there is nothing that needs to be done urgently. No major decision is waiting for you. No right or wrong choice needs to be declared. After going deep enough, the most natural thing is not to keep diving, but to rise slowly. Not to return to the same noisy surface as before, but to allow your body and awareness to decompress. You don't need to carry everything you saw down there with you, just enough to stand still in a softer light, where everything returns to a natural rhythm of breathing. You may still meet people, still shake hands, still smile, and at times, you may still forget names. But the difference is this. You no longer have to condemn yourself for it. You know that you can dive deep, and you also know that you can surface again. There is no need to choose sides. No need to be loyal to any fixed image of who you are. You only need to allow your attention to move in the way it already knows how. In this space, no one asks you to remember better. No one demands that you fix anything in order to fit in more smoothly. If there is anything worth keeping, it is the quiet sense of realizing that the way you operate is not a flaw that needs repairing, but a structure that formed long ago to help you survive and understand the world in your own way. If you are listening up to this point and don't feel the need to react immediately, don't feel compelled to nod or push back, but instead find yourself in a very quiet moment, as if someone has just put the right words to an old experience, then perhaps you don't need any further explanation. You can stay in that quiet a little longer, and if, when you later return to the world, you find that you still remember what truly matters, then that alone says everything.